So I entitled this sermon, Does God Still Love the Jews? Question mark. The answer is obvious. Of course he loves the Jews. But it was a catchy title, so I got your attention. The reason I was moved to look at this subject is because a week or two ago there was a motion to censure the nation of Israel for building settlements on occupied territory. And a whole bunch of nations lined up to say, we really don't think that's right. And they lined up, ready for this motion of censure. And typically, on occasions like this, when an attempt is made to say something blunt to Israel or to slap Israel on the wrist for something, the United States stands up and says, no, we veto that. And of course, it only takes one vote to veto that and shut the whole thing down. This time, apparently, President Obama said to the representative of the United States at the UN, just abstain. Don't do anything. And the backlash to that was quite something. Wow! You're supposed to stand up for Israel. You're supposed to beat back all those critics. In fact, the United Kingdom, Great Britain, perhaps you can call it whatever you like. I like Great Britain. But anyway, said, hey, you guys are supposed to stand up. We said something snarky about Israel. We issued a rebuke, but we expected you to veto our rebuke, so we didn't actually have to, stand behind those words. And harsh things came out of the Prime Minister's office in England, and it seemed to be a ridiculous situation. And the response from the United States was, wait a second, all we did was agree with you, or fail to argue with you. We agree with you on every other item. We're very supportive of Israel. And yet suddenly you're getting all on our case here because we didn't sort of play this role in this international drama which we're supposed to play. I personally think that Donald Trump, who was critical of President Obama for this, has stated and has a big enough ego to believe that he would like to tackle the problem in the Middle East. And as he speculated on a few occasions, wouldn't it be the ultimate deal to be able to strike some harmony and accord that would bring about a lasting peace between the Palestinian Arabs and the Jews in the state of Israel? And of course, he has a son-in-law who is a practicing Jew and comes from a Jewish family. His daughter is converted to Judaism. His grandchildren are being raised as Jews. So perhaps you could say he has an emotional commitment, or he has a desire to see a lasting. Every president of the United States who has come into office has come in with the desire to do something dramatic that could bring about a lasting peace in the Middle East. So I don't think Mr. Trump, who knows that something would eventually have to be done about those settlements being built on occupied territory, and I mean, there's a substantial number now. I think about 50 or 60,000 Israelis live in settlements that have been established in occupied territory. So it's a political problem. And if a solution is ever to become permanent, even the Supreme Court of Israel, has, in certain circumstances, said, those aren't legitimate settlements. That's not a blanket ruling they've given to everything, but on several occasions they have ruled, I'm not sure we should be there. I'm paraphrasing here. They're saying, we're sure, the Supreme Court of Israel, that you shouldn't be building there. And of course, the government has ignored that on numerous occasions. And Israeli settlers, who are pretty stubborn and strong-minded to want to live in an area claimed by Palestinian Arabs, themselves have ignored that. The controversy, of course, that goes back and forth in the minds of Christians, and here's where we get to the reason for the sermon, and perhaps several sermons on this subject, is simply this. Some Christians believe that God has given the land of Israel to modern-day state of Israel, modern-day Jews and Judaism. meaning from the Mediterranean all the way to the Jordan River. That West Bank really belongs to Israel. You have to answer that question for yourself. Is that a fact in 2017? Some people believe it is. Jimmy Carter, a very prominent member of the international community, a former president of the United States, a smart individual and a very devout, practicing Christian, wrote a book a few years ago in which he clearly made the point that the Israelis do not have the right to suppress the Palestinian Arabs. And he made the point that the Palestinian Arabs, under the occupation of the Israelis, he said, have been denied their human rights. And he made some very strong and embarrassing points. Certainly as a Christian, he does not believe that the Israelis are in the right. In fact, these questions that are really practical questions for Christians go all the way to the point of asking the question, do the Jews have to come to recognize and accept Jesus Christ as their Savior to be reconciled to their Father in heaven? And the statement by Paul that there is no other name under heaven by which men may be saved, that is denied by some Christians who say very bluntly that no. In fact, one prominent radio and television evangelist I've seen, he has invited Benjamin Netanyahu to his huge church in San Antonio, Texas, as a great friend of Israel, also has stated that as far as he's concerned, to try to persuade a Jew that he needs to understand and accept Jesus Christ as his Savior is a blasphemy. It is a ridiculous thing. And so these are practical questions for Christians and also practical questions for politicians. Could Mr. Trump actually experience success and bringing peace to the Middle East, perhaps hiding a little bit behind President Obama's declaration, we don't always agree with some of the things that Israel does. Perhaps he could use that to his political advantage by saying, well, not everybody is on your side, Israel, so you better listen to me and work with me for the next 4, hopefully 8 years, and see if we can move things along and have some success. So, let's tackle the question. Let me restate that God loves the Jews, and personally, I love the state of Israel. Been there a couple of times, and in fact I have a picture, I'll just put that up, of Jerusalem of gold. I hope to go back again sometime in the near future. I'd very much like to go to the Western Wall that's pictured there, and again offer prayer. And I'd very much enjoy standing, in fact, where that picture is taken from, in the Jewish quarter in the old city, and viewing that. I remember standing in that very spot many years ago now, on a Sabbath evening, as the Sabbath was drawing to a close, and being overawed at the sense of occasion, the sense of beauty, the sense of God's love for Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, and coming to understand a little bit better why he says throughout the Old Testament, Jerusalem is the apple of his eye. But if we're going to understand and perhaps move our theology and our prejudices to a firm basis, we do have to understand the history of the conflict that exists there. And to do that, I will give you today a brief history of that conflict, going all the way back to the beginning. The beginning would be perhaps Father Abraham, who journeyed through that land and was a pilgrim in that land, and could not buy postage stamp. In fact, eventually, if you recall the story, he needed land to bury his wife. And the Hittites, who ruled over that land, tribal people who came out of what we would call Turkey, did not allow him to own land. That's why he was a pilgrim and why he lived in tents and why he journeyed. And when it came time, and he purchased a field called the Field of Machpelah, he purchased it, and there was a very specific contract drawn up, which these days we understand was very much on the format of a Hittite land contract. That's just one of the many little proofs that come out of the book of Genesis showing its authenticity and its historical reliability. There are a couple of quirks to that contract. You know, you had to count the number of trees in the field and things like that. And so Abraham purchased himself a piece of land, and it became sort of the burial plot for him and his family. Now, the controversy that arises does not arise with Abraham, who has numerous children, does not arise with Isaac, but arises with the third generation. Two boys who are born as twins, Jacob and Esau. And as you recall the story, Esau is born first, and Jacob follows very quickly behind. And he appears to be sort of holding his brother's foot as he's born. And so he literally is called the heel catcher. They would call their children that back then. Perhaps some particular quirk or some particular story surrounding the birth would give rise to a name. Your name, my name, doesn't mean a great deal. But the name of Jacob connoted heel catcher. It also was interesting in as much as Jacob was a little bit of a wheeler-dealer. Remember, his grandfather, Abraham, was what? A trader. He was a tradesman. And he was a tradesman in the Semitic sense. Now, if you've ever tried to bargain, anybody who ever tried bargain, let's say in Greece or Turkey or Syria or Lebanon or Israel, anybody who had that experience? Yes, you have. You know what it's like. I remember going to, in the old part of Jerusalem to buy some slide film, and it started off as 7 shekels for a roll of slide. And at the time I didn't realize I was flashing this stuff, compulsively. And it was 7 shekels, but we bargained a little bit, and we finally got down to a reasonable price, which was 3. Now, you ever go into Walmart here and say $7? Well, I feel like paying 3. See what happens. And if you want to argue with the checkout lady, see what happens. Well, there, we waltzed back and forth, and it took me 5 or 7, 8, 10 minutes, but eventually I paid 3 shekels, and I walked away. The following day, I was already out of slide film, so I went back to the same trader, and I said, I'd like a 2 rolls, please. And that will be 7 shekels each. And at that particular point, forgetting where I was, I rolled my eyes and said something like, "Oh, for pity's sake." And he grabbed me by the arm and pulled me aside. He said, listen to me. You are in my country now. You have come into my culture. Things are different. Kindly talk back and forth to me. Well, you'll pay the same as you paid yesterday, but take some time. And he was offended. And he instructed me there's a way to go about things. I ask 7, you offer 1. I say 6, you say 2. I say 5, you pout a little bit, and there's a waltz that takes place. And you should understand that. You were here yesterday. How many days do you have to come back before you learn the trade? Well, and so this was the nature. Abraham was a trader. Isaac, family business, trade. You ask the question, why did these patriarchs have money and much cattle and everything else? Well, they would move from community to community. They would trade back and forth the animals so that they could get different stock in and so forth. And you had to make the difference in a trade with cash. And so they needed cash. The typical farmer didn't need cash. The homesteader didn't need cash, but the trader needed cash. And that's why it says that Abraham was increased much with coin, with other assets. Now, When it came time for Isaac's kids to grow up and enter the family business, Jacob took to it quite naturally. He liked playing with the abacus, I suppose. He liked adding up the numbers. He liked bickering. Esau was, I don't have patience for this. Well, what do you have patience for? Stalking animals, bringing them down with my bow and arrow. Esau loved the outdoors. Jacob was an indoor cat. You're talking about the difference between a wild cat that likes to hunt at night and Garfield, who prefers to have his lasagna served on a plate warmed. Thank you very much. The indoor cat, the outdoor cat. In fact, it says even of the two of them that Esau was a hairy, muscular type, and Jacob was a smoothie, in more ways than one. Now, as the story develops, you remember this, Jacob inserts himself in there and he, quote, steals the birthright from Esau. As a result of that, it says he has to flee and he goes back to the ancestral home, which is in Syria. Remember, when Abraham sends for a wife for Isaac, where does he go? Back to Syria. Where Isaac's son has to run away. He runs away to Syria, where the families come from. And when he goes to Syria, he hangs out with his uncle Laban. Now, if you thought that Abraham and Isaac were good traders, they were sharp negotiators, Laban was on steroids. Laban, and again, I don't know if you've had this experience. I've heard of some of you who've been in contracting, perhaps doing renovations or trying to work with people who want things done. And some customers change their mind, it seems, every time the wind blows. They like this, but now they like that. And have you thought of something else? And their mind constantly changes. Laban was that way. If he saw things going in a direction he didn't like, he immediately renegotiated. In fact, in the immortal words of Donald Trump, which wasn't too tactful, when he was addressing a group of Jews in New York, literally opened with, "Is there anybody in this room who doesn't constantly renegotiate?" That's one of his traits. If he's doing business, he negotiates, he makes a deal, then he renegotiates, and he renegotiates constantly. Well, Laban was that way on steroids. And if Jacob was a sneaky heel catcher who stole the birthright from his brother, he got repayment in spades. You remember the story? He works for 7 years to marry a girl. He gets married. He wakes up in the morning and finds he's married to the wrong one. Any of you had that experience? No. What do you do? Hey, wait a second. What happened here? Now, weddings back then were not done in a church. Okay, weddings where one family gets together with another, they have a big party, and then they take the bride and the groom and they go off to a tent, and that's it. Well, obviously the party was more than Jacob bargained for, and somebody spiked the camel milk, and he didn't realize exactly who he was marrying, apparently. Because when he woke up in the morning, he said, "Wait a second, Laban, I contracted to marry one girl, and you've given me the wrong one." "Did I do that?" said Laban. "I'm sorry, I should have told you the oldest girl has to marry first. But don't worry, you can have the other sister as well. We're a polygamous society." And so another week goes by, and he has another wedding. And this time now he's got 2 wives. "Oh, but by the way, you have to work another 7 years to pay for this one." And so he's there for 14 years working for a miserable, manipulative relative. If he was a sneaky heel catcher, he's being repaid in spades. Now, if you stay another 7 years, I'll give you a share of the herd. I'll give you all these other things. And so for another 7 years, he labors for Laban. Finally, after 21 years, Jacob leaves Laban, but he can't leave the patriarch Laban because, well, the patriarch has the ultimate power of life and death over all those in his clan. And so he actually leaves and sneaks away. If you remember the story, Laban follows after him, catches up, and they have a confrontation. And Jacob finally loses it, and he says, 7 times you changed the deal we had. And that expression 7 times doesn't mean 7 times. It means constantly and forever are you changing the deal. You said I could have the spotted cattle, but then being good at breeding cattle, a lot more spotted cattle come along. Oh, no, stripes are yours. Now he breeds more striped cattle. No, polka dots are yours, or whatever. He changes the rules. And you notice that in those arguments, Jacob doesn't say, I have the right to be my own man and take my family. When Laban says, why have you taken my grandchildren? He doesn't say, well, they're my children. He recognizes that Laban has authority here. But Laban can only push his luck so far. And what happens essentially is they come to an agreement. They build this little pile of rocks. And it's as if Jacob says, you stay on your side, I stay on my side, or there's going to be problems from now on. And so after an absence of 21 years, Jacob comes back into the promised land. In coming back, he knows he has to face his brother. And in facing his brother, he does know what he's going to run into. It tells us that along the way, as he's coming back into the promised land, he meets God. In fact, he meets the incarnation, Son of God. This is a sort of a pre-incarnation appearance of Jesus the Christ. And it tells us that he talks with God until the morning. And he says, don't leave me without a blessing. He says, no, I'm going to leave you. And it says that Jacob takes hold of the messenger of God, and they wrestle. And he will not let go. He just hangs on, because now, instead of living by his wits, he knows there's a greater power in the earth. That he either lives in accordance with God, who can bless him, or he could basically find himself back in this promised land, but facing his brother and all sorts of disaster. And so he hangs on until it says the servant of God says, hey, I'm going to leave. And so he just touches him, and he puts his hip out of joint. He essentially cripples him. And now he says to him, you're really different. You're no longer living by your wits. You no longer think you've got to be super clever and manipulate circumstances. You're now humble, and you're desperate enough that you will hang on to God. I will change your name from heel catcher, or as we might say, manipulative little sneaky fill in the blank. I will change your name to Israel. He who prevails with God. And that is testimony to the change in spirit that has taken place in this man. Now he comes back and he meets his brother Esau. And he sends him gifts, and he sends him apologies, and he sends him sacrifice. And it says that Esau meets him. It says, hey, all that was a long time ago. I'm doing great. You went away to Syria. Yeah, apparently you got yourself 2 wives, you got 2 handmaids, you got almost a dozen kids here. Me? I got a whole bunch of wives too. I got a whole bunch of kids too. And I get to hunt, and when I'm not hunting, I'm fishing. And when I'm not fishing, I'm just letting the grandkids run all over me. I'm having a great time. Good for you, brother. And they, it says, are reconciled. And then they go their separate ways. If you look at where sort of people settled, Israel, Jacob and his family, obviously they settle in what is called the Promised Land. And the children of Esau, they sort of settled down to the south and east side of the Dead Sea. It's not quite as perhaps blessed, but it's not, it's not horrible. In fact, if you look at ancient maps of that area and all of the archaeological excavations that are done, it's obvious that there were a lot of agricultural communities. There were a lot of, vineyards and olive groves, things like that. It may not have been as fertile as the Promised Land, but it was okay. It wasn't, in the middle of a desert somewhere. And it tells us that Israel grows. They begin to multiply. But we also read that Esau is no slouch either. Esau's family grows, and if you remember, just as Israel gives rise to a dozen kids or so, and these become known as tribes, Esau also has a dozen kids or so. And his name, which was Esau, is changed to sort of a tribal name, which is the name Edom. Edom. So Jacob and Esau become Israel and Edom. And Edom, it says, has quite a few clans, and they are lumped under the name the Dukes of Edom. Distantly related to the Dukes of Hazzard, we are told. But anyway. No, for whatever reason, that name is used. And so you say, well, Israel becomes quite mighty and established. Well, no, these are like a dozen different tiny clans that begin to develop. But the same is happening over here with Esau. Now, it's one thing for Esau to tell his brother Jacob, hey, life's turned out great for me. If you want the family business of trading cattle and keeping track and ledgers, have at it. I'm for the great outdoors. Unfortunately, not all of Esau's kids see it that way. And they, of course, are very familiar with the story of how Uncle Israel gypped, Father Edom out of the better land, the birthright blessing. And so as the stories grow, there is tension between those two families. The cousins don't talk to each other. The second, the third, the fourth generation, they don't talk very much. Now, what happens to Jacob's children? You remember that story? What's the next step in the saga? All of you know it. There's a famine, and they go down into Egypt. And when the people of Israel go into Egypt, what happens? They go down, maybe there are 50, 60, 70, 80 of them. And 4 or 5 generations pass. And it tells us that the Israelis are very, very fertile. Very fertile indeed. So after a couple of 100 years, what do you have? Well, by some calculations, you have well over 1 million Israelis. And there are, of course, tensions between them and the Egyptians. And you recall the story. The Egyptians start throwing Hebrew children into the Nile. And a hero has to arise, and that hero is Moses. And under God's inspiration and leadership, he leads Israel out of Egypt. The story is called the story of the Exodus. Now, all of you know that story. We've gone now from Jacob and a bunch of small families into clans, substantial family gatherings, and they come out during the Exodus. As they come out of the Exodus, they journey south towards Mount Sinai, and of all things, there appears a sneak attack that comes against them. And you might say, well, who are these people who appear from nowhere? And they are called the Amalekites. They apparently force march across the Sinai, and they attack Israel as they struggle out of Egypt and are trying to head down towards Sinai. There's no explanation given for that, but it tells us that, and if you look under the dukes of Edom, the clans of Esau, you find one of them is called Amalek. And Amalek gives rise to the Amalekites. Typically, a principal tribe could take the lead. You are very familiar with God's expression about Israel. He says, Israel, my people, Ephraim is my firstborn. Now, Ephraim wasn't the firstborn, but it was the principal tribe being described as taking leadership at that time. So sometimes Israel is just referred to as Ephraim. Sometimes Edom is called Amalek. And the Amalekites appear out of nowhere, and they attack Israel as they're straggling out. And those Amalekites are the descendants of Esau, the principal tribe of the nation of Edom. And you read this in Deuteronomy 25 and verse 17. Remember, God says to Israel, what the Amalekites did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary and worn out, they met you on your journey and attacked all who were lagging behind. They had no fear of God. Why did they leave their area over there to the south and east of the Dead Sea and come zipping across Sinai in a forced march and make a terrorist attack to the straggling members of the Israeli nation as they were making an exodus from Egypt? And again, you remember that story that Israel wasn't organized, they couldn't fight. When they tried to put up resistance, the only way that they won the battle was when Moses raised his hands, and it says the people were empowered. And after a while, Moses became tired and his hands drooped down, and the Israelis started losing the battle. And they say, whoa, the old guy's got to keep his hands up. And so Joshua and Caleb get either side, and they hold his hands up. And all the blood drains to the center of his chest, and Moses is staggering there. But as long as his hands are in the air, Israel is able to beat off the attack. It's obviously a miraculous deliverance from God. And so God's comment on this is, when the Lord your God gives you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land he is giving you to possess an inheritance, you'll remember what Amalek did. You shall blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget. Now you find that repeated in different ways. And what God told Israel is, you will have war with Amalek, and you're going to have to suppress them. You're going to have to drive them out. You are going to have to face the fact that you have a perpetual enemy. Why is that? Well, the answer is, when Edom, and especially the tribe of Amalek, heard that the cousins were delivered from Egypt, they knew that they'd be heading back that way, and that they would again be in conflict with them. In fact, as it turns out, Israel takes 40 years to sort of remake the nation. The old guard dies off, the young ones arise, and when they pass by to go into the, quote, promised land, unquote, it says that they sort of request, can we have passage? And the Edomites say, absolutely not. You need a favor from us? Forget it. You stay there, we stay here, and don't you come anywhere near us. In fact, there's tension and difficulty, but Israel goes around, enters into the promised land, and becomes victorious. They settle the promised land, but there is still the problem of Edom, our brothers literally over there. And what was the king's responsibility? The king's responsibility was to drive the Amalekites out. In fact, you look at it, you would say, in that context, the king's responsibility was to perpetuate a genocide against Amalek. That's the way it's described. How many of you remember the old story about Saul and Samuel? You know, that story where Saul, the prophet, sacrifices because he thinks Samuel isn't going to show up. Somebody cited it to me a couple of weeks ago. In fact, it was at Lowell Ross. You look back at that story, and it evolves this way. Samuel says to King Saul, you got to go out and you got to tackle the problem of our cousins, the Amalekites. And I want you to round them up and put them to the sword. Now, this is pretty brutal. This is pretty bloody. And so that's what they do. And furthermore, Saul, I want you to wait, and I will eventually meet up with you, and we'll sacrifice and thank God for the victory. Saul goes to war, and he's victorious. And he gets a little bit impatient, and he's waiting for Samuel. And he said, the old codger's not showing up. Let's just have a sacrifice and get done with it. So they offer a sacrifice, and just as the smoke is rising, here comes the old prophet over the hill. And now Saul's a little bit embarrassed. He says, oh man, we waited so long for you, Samuel. And we thought, we didn't know, maybe something happened. Maybe the wheel fell off the chariot. It had a nasty accident. Who knows what? So we made sacrifice. Okay, says Samuel. What did the Lord send you to do? Well, the Lord sent us to obliterate the people and kill everything. Not just the people. The goats, the sheep, everything. And Samuel asked the question, well, what is this bleating of sheep that I hear in my ears? Oh, I forgot to mention, the people wanted to spare the best of the flock and herds so that we could make sacrifices to the Lord. And who's that over there? Oh, well, actually, that's the king of the Amalekites. His name is Agag. Would you like to meet him? And Samuel says, yeah, I'd like to meet him. And so Agag comes over and says, hi, nice to see you, nice to meet you. I'm sure we can all agree there's been enough bloodshed for one day. All right? Me and a few members of my family, a couple of the royalty here, and so forth. We agree, you've beaten us in battle, you've slaughtered all of our people. There's been, of course, some of his family had just escaped to Egypt, by the way. He says, surely we've had enough bloodshed for one day. You know what the old prophet Samuel says? He says, number one, we're going to have a little more bloodshed. And number two, Saul, because you did not remember the words of God, that you were to obliterate everyone and everything, you just lost the kingdom. You just lost the royal privilege. Your children and grandchildren, they won't inherit the throne. God has chosen somebody else to take your place. There's an old, I don't know if you make it out actually, but there's an old famous painting. As you can see, well, maybe you don't see much of it, but the poor fellow kneeling in front, that's Agag. And the one holding the sword there, his hair flying in the wind, is the old prophet Samuel. And it says that he hacks him to pieces, if you could imagine that. The dignified prophet takes a sword and just smack, smack, whack, 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 and reduces King Agag into little pieces. You might say, well, that's a very, very nasty thing to do. That's a very emotional thing to do. But I want you to remember the consequences of disobedience. The consequences of disobedience for the nation of Israel are eventually, they end up in a captivity. They are exiled from the land by God, and they are sent to the east, to Babylon. I'm sure most of you know that story as well. And most of you have probably know the words, even though you don't know where they're from, of Psalm 137. You remember these words? By the waters of Babylon we sat and wept, where we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing your happy songs of Jerusalem now. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Remember, Lord, what our cousins the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. And this is typical of the history of Israel. Whoever the enemy is that comes against Jerusalem, here come the Egyptians. The Egyptians, and who's tagging along behind them? The Edomites, our relatives. Here come the Assyrians, and who's tagging along behind them? Our relatives, the Edomites. Eventually, after all said and done, who conquers Jerusalem? It's the Babylonians. And as people are fleeing away from Jerusalem, who stands in the road and turns them back? The Edomites. And this is one little aspect of this. Remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to the foundations. And daughter Babylon, doomed to destruction. Of course, eventually Babylon gets hers. But doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. And of course, this is one of the most horrible passages of the Bible. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. Horrible. But this is the mindset of those who have been driven into captivity. And generation after generation, because they did not overcome the Amalekite problem, there is warfare. In fact, if you read on after the story of Babylon's fall, we come to a time of captivity under the Persians. And under the Persians, there is a very interesting story told in the book of Ruth. Now, all of you are, no, not the book of Ruth, I'm sorry. I'm talking about the story of Purim here, the story of Esther. Now, how many of you remember the story of Esther? Oh, okay. You remember the two characters? There is a very high-ranking official by the name of Haman, who, by the way, it says is a descendant of a fellow by the name of Agag. Remember all the way back there, that king whose family escaped to Egypt? Agag. In fact, the family clan name is the Agagites. And Haman is a descendant of that family. And in the presence of Saul, the king, Agag died at the hand of the prophet Samuel. The other personality who's mentioned in this story is a Jew by the name of Mordecai, a Jew who is descended from the royal household of Saul. Grandson versus grandson. Do you think Haman, when he plotted his intrigue to put all the Jews to death on one specific day, do you think Haman had any recollection of what the Jews had done to his great-great-great-grandfather, King Agag? Absolutely. All you've done is moved the hatred and the warfare from the promised land over into Babylon. All you've done is bring the great-great-great-grandson of Haman into conflict with the great-great-great-grandson of Saul. And the whole scenario is played out again in the book of Esther. And it takes miraculous deliverance for the one to survive the intrigue of the other. If you remember, Haman eventually ends up being hung on the very scaffold that he had built to hang Mordecai. But that's the way the story continues, generation after generation after generation. Not with clear, vivid memories of how Jacob swindled Esau, but with now an inbred DNA that says, I was born to resent these people. An inbred DNA that said, I was born to defend myself against the hostilities of these people. No, when they return to Jerusalem, and there's a renewal of the covenant between the people of God, the chosen people of God, and the eternal God, and the temple is rebuilt, and sacrifices are reestablished, and eventually Jesus is born into that milieu. It tells us that there is a king who comes from the area south of Jerusalem that is called Idumea. He is called Herod the Great, and he is clearly a descendant of the ancient people of Esau. He's politically appointed by the Romans, but can you imagine the hatred and the resentment that the Jews must have felt? That's why Herod bribed them with literally billions of dollars of subsidy to rebuild the temple and to do all sorts of other nice things. He did that. On the other hand, if you have any familiarity with the promised land, he built himself half a dozen fortresses. You know, you've heard of Masada, built by Herod. The Herodian, built by Herod. He had half a dozen places like that because he never, ever felt any security, and he certainly didn't feel a whole lot of love coming from the Jews. He knew he was a politically appointed king. And when he heard that the Jews had a Messiah born, possibly in the area of Bethlehem, what did he do? He butchered every child that he could get his hands on. And that same particular story continues all the way down to that time then. The Jews were eventually banished from Jerusalem. They were banished by the Romans, and the Romans literally, in an effort to bring peace to that area, said as long as there's a Jew that looks at a Temple Mount and a temple, as long as there is a Jew who thinks that Jerusalem is special or precious, we will never, ever have peace in this area. And so they destroyed Jerusalem, completely and totally obliterated it. In fact, today, if you try to look at the original Jerusalem that Jesus walked on in his day, it is some 50 feet below the present level of Jerusalem. When the Romans leveled it, they recreated Jerusalem. They called it Aerial Capitolina, and they sort of reshaped the thing as almost like an oval. They obliterated as much as possible. And of course, they banned, Jews could not just not come to Jerusalem. They couldn't come, I think it's within 70 miles of Jerusalem. No Jew was allowed to get any closer than that. And that, my friends, coincided with the end of what we call the Old Covenant. Remember when Jesus was in the week of his betrayal, coming up to Jerusalem, and it says he stopped and he looked and he wept over Jerusalem? Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her chicks, but you wouldn't have it. And so your day is past. Your house is in ruins, meaning your establishment is gone. You no longer are, quote, the chosen people, unquote. With the end of the Old Covenant and the end of the temple and the end of the nation, we see a clear demarcation. And here now you have a challenging thought for Christians. Most Christians accept this and understand this. Some Christians stubbornly resist this. And they say, how can you possibly set aside God's chosen people as the vessel to bring light to the world? And my answer to that is easy. There is now a new Son of God. Israel was always called the Son of God, and Ephraim my firstborn, things like that. If you read in the book of Matthew, Matthew, who writes to the Jews, very, very specifically talks about how Jesus has fulfilled the promises that Israel could not fulfill. Remember that little story in Matthew about Jesus and his mom and dad fleeing to Egypt? And Matthew reports that. He says, this was done that it might be fulfilled that was written by the prophets. Quote, out of Egypt have I drawn my son. Now everybody knew that the first reference that had was to Israel. Israel, my son, is brought out of Egypt. But here Jesus is specifically shown as going down into Egypt and himself being brought out. And Matthew doesn't hesitate to point out not just the parallel, but the ultimate fulfillment of that prophecy. In fact, when you read of Peter talking to the Sanhedrin, he tells them very clearly, Jesus comes along and finds the house of David in ruins. The tent of David has collapsed, he says. But Jesus has come along and he has lifted it up. And he has restored dignity to the throne of David. Why? Because he is the ultimate king who is supposed to sit on that particular throne. That was the promise. And so if you are of a mind to sort of reject that, then the derogatory phrase is replacement theology. You are replacing Israel, the light of the world, with the church, which Jesus ironically says is what? You, the light of the world that cannot be hid. You are replacing Israel's king with Israel's king, Jesus. And you are saying that the son who was given the opportunity and who failed has been replaced by the son who has now made a new covenant and picked up those challenges, responsibilities, and promises, and himself will succeed. Jesus is the fulfillment of all those things. Now, when I studied through some of these things, I was attending a Baptist seminary, and the professor of New Testament there put it very simply. He said, all promises that pertained to Israel and were not fulfilled, were not delivered, he said, are found in their fulfillment in Jesus the Christ. He said, it's very logical, it's very reasonable. And I sat there and I thought, absolutely, because we had a 100% agreement. I have some old friends who, when I say that, they bristle and they get tense because you're in some way or other insulting Israel's covenant with God. Well, I'm sorry. You may be an eminent evangelist from San Antonio, Texas, but when you try telling me that Israel has a pathway to God that goes past Jesus, I can't reconcile that with the New Testament. When you tell me that in some way or other they are not required to find Jesus, either now or in the future or whenever in His mercy and His grace He allows that. I am not charged with the responsibility to stir up dislike and hatred and resentment. But on the other hand, in my own thinking, I am charged with keeping the facts clear. And Jesus the Christ is the fulfillment of all the hopes and dreams that Israel could not fulfill. And so as I look at this, and I began by posing the question, does God still love the Jews? Yes, He loves them so much. He gave His only begotten Son that they might have life everlasting, and they will have it. But does He love the Jews in a particular way that makes them a unique entity today? The answer is they are as unique as you and I. That's why Paul, when he made the very simple statement, says, in Christ there is no longer Jew and Gentile. And when he said that, to be a Jew was to be with the in crowd. All the rabbis knew. To be a Gentile meant to be goyim, meaning the rest. There's no longer master and slave. Very obvious comparison there. If you're the master, you're doing well. If you're the slave, not so much. If you're the Jew, you're doing well. If you're the goyim, not so much. There is neither male nor female. If you're a man in that culture, is to do well. To be female, not so much. In Christ, all of humanity has been reconciled to God the Father in heaven. That's a very obvious theme in the New Testament. And so when we speculate, let's say, does Israel today have a right to exist? And the answer is yes. All of the borders determined by international treaties and everything else are clearly established. But does Israel today have a time-honored right to look across their border and say, you know, in the old days, Solomon garrisoned Damascus, the capital of Syria. In the old days, we were promised from the border of Egypt all the way to the Euphrates. That'll mean we'll be moving through Lebanon and Syria and all sorts of areas. In the old days, we occupied Gilead, which is, of course, a major part. I think the capital of Jordan, Amman, is in ancient Gilead. You know, does that mean that you can speculate and say ultimately that the Jewish nation is entitled to expand to those borders? Nobody in their right mind would speculate that today. But that's the way the thinking can go. And, you know, you can have other interesting quirks as well. I know when I was in Israel, I was touring with some Christians the last time I was there, and a point was made, we went to a food bank, and the point was made that quite a few wives and children of rabbis came to that food bank. Why was that? Well, because it was considered something that a rabbi who devoted his time to studying the books of Moses was too busy to work, too busy to earn a living, certainly had no responsibility to actually feed his wife and children. Therefore, there were some Christians who felt, well, you know, we should support rabbis, we should support their families, and they were quite pleased to hear that's what the food bank did. I must admit, I was remembering the words of Rabbi Paul, who said, if a man will not work, he should not eat. Now, if you're a teacher of the law, and that's your work, that's one thing. But to think you can just check out, you know, you look for eccentricities in the thinking. to think that, are there eccentricities among Muslims? Yeah. Can you lead yourself to eccentricities in thinking among Jews? Yes, you can. You can reason yourself away, which is why a clear-thinking Christian like Jimmy Carter can write a book and say, as Christians, we can miss the point and feel that in supporting certain Jewish ideas, we can be actually wrong. And so, what we've done today is we've looked at a history of tension between two brothers. A tension that has come down through 1,500 years before Jesus and another 2,000 years since, and continues to exist. And even though we're going to talk some more about this, I'm going to close with a little thought. Over the last 20 years, it's become very popular to use DNA testing to establishing who is related to who. DNA has established some interesting facts of life. When the folks who live in Israel were tested, they found out, you can establish certain things. When they test, let's say in England, they find that certain areas of England are very, 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 very closely related to certain areas in France. Any thoughts as to why that may be? Well, clearly the British like croissants and espresso coffee. No, that's a joke. I threw that out to you, Pastor. No. It's because the French had a habit of invading England every now and then. And so they would dominate certain areas and, a little intermarriage, and you have some interesting results. Same thing in France. When you can go back, and there was a time up until the Middle Ages when the King of England was also the king of part of France. Back and forth it used to go. I think Henry VIII had holdings in France up until as late as that time. In the same way, I know some of you have had DNA testing done, and which part of you is taken from one area and which part of you is taken from another. In very simple terms, the Jews who live in Israel today are very, 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 very closely related to another ethnic group. What group is that? The Palestinian Arabs. Yasser Arafat, Benjamin Netanyahu, extremely closely related. Why? Because they're brothers. They're descended from brothers. The next ethnic group that the Jews are related to live where? In Syria. Why? Because Abraham came from Syria, and he went back there to get a wife for Isaac. And Jacob fled there and got 2 wives and 2 handmaids, and his entire kids, their DNA is soaked in Syrian heritage. And so Israel, when you look at, of course, I don't want to play this too much, but when you're in Israel, you can't necessarily look at somebody and say, oh, you're Arab and you're Jew, because there are very dark-skinned, swarthy Jewish men and light-skinned Arab men, and you look at them and you say, well, which family do you belong to? And they actually belong to the same family. They are brothers. They are cousins. And the resolution to the conflict, which is so much part of their DNA, tells me that maybe there's a temporary solution to the problem, and that Mr. Trump may have some success with business solutions, with political solutions, and if there's any hope for that, I would pray for that earnestly, because we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem, the prophet says. On the other hand, if you expect in this lifetime and in human effort to find a solution to who rightly owns this land, that day is long past. It will take the return of Jesus Christ, literally, to bring those people into one family again. That's the only solution. And that's what the prophets say. Amalek will have to be reabsorbed into the people of Israel. They can't exist as two different entities because war will always be there in the human realm. And so, God in His love will eventually bring them together and bring them into the one family that they already really are. Just as we have been reconciled through Jesus Christ to our Father in heaven, and we are one family, they physically and spiritually have to become the same way. In the meantime, it would be, I feel, inappropriate to root for and to cheer for the Jews over the Palestinians, because they have a right to peace and the love of God just as much as any Jew. And there will be only very limited success on the part of any politician who mingles in this particular problem. Why? Because as we rehearsed today, the history goes back 3,500 years.